Namaskar viewers. In my today's lecture, I am going to take up a very prominent and watershed moment in the history of English literature, and that is naughty 90s. That is naughty 90s. Naughty 90s are this is called naughty 90s. This period is also called aesthetic period, aesthetic, decadence, right? Decadence, fin de siècle, fin de siècle, the turn of century, the turn of century. So these are in fact certain terms that is applied for late Victorian period. For the period 1990s means the period around 1890, after 1885 you can say. What happened that this period is very crucial and important because of the rebellion against the strict morality of Victorian society, right? There was a strict morality. This morality is very important because Victorian society is highly moralistic society. There was a concept like good, like ethical, right? Good, ethical, like virtue, like metaphysics, This was very important. That there is a concept like good and evil. That good is very important. Good, virtuous, This is called Victorian morality. So if you read Victorian fiction, basically they are highly moralistic. They are basically for society. Art is for the sake of truth. Art is for the sake of society. जो विक्टोरियन लिटरेचर था दैट वाज बेसिकली फॉर आर्ट. जो आर्ट था, आर्ट मीन्स जो लिटरेचर था, दिस लिटरेचर वाज फॉर द रीडर्स सेक, फॉर द रीडर्स सेक, फॉर द सोसाइटी सेक. ये समाज की बात करता था, समाज के लिए. जो लिटरेचर था उसका एक ही मकसद था, टू इम्प्रूव सोसाइटी. एंड दैट्स व्हाई मोस्ट ऑफ द फिक्शंस दे वर सीरियलाइज्ड. They were written in serial form. However, जब हम आगे बढ़ते हैं, and this is called around 1800, in fact 90, that is called naughty 90s, or decadence, or aesthetic, or findasical, that they think that literature is not basically for society's sake, or literature is not basically for reader's sake. Or if I say that the purpose of literature is not to explore any moral idea, rather it is for art's sake. And that's why when you read fiction, basically you find picture, like picture of Dorian Gray, as I told you, picture of Dorian Gray. This is written by Oscar Wilde. Or you can read Portrait of a Lady. Portrait of a Lady. This is by Henry James. This is by Oscar Wilde. This is by Henry James. This is by, there is also an interesting book called A Portrait of the Artist. A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. This is by James Joyce. So there is a lot of portrayal. This portray is very important. So what is portrayal? Portrayal is basically about art. Art for art's sake. Right? For example, if you read these fictions, you don't find any moral idea. Hardly you find any preaching. Hardly you find any moral message. Or you don't find literature that is playing the role of pedagogical teaching. Basically, they are for art's sake, and that's why the motive of art, for the motive for aesthetic movement is art for art's sake. Art for art's sake. जो राइटिंग है, जो लिटरेचर है, दिस इज बेसिकली अबाउट द बुक itself. That is objectivity, completely objectivity, and that's why, because you know that, and this is the completely reaction against Victorian society. So therefore, when you read this 1990s or Findesical or the movement like aesthetic or the movement like decadence, you must keep in mind certain writers, and one is Walter Pater. Walter Pater. The interesting book is into the Renaissance. The Renaissance. He has written a book called The Renaissance, and the concluding chapter of Renaissance. This is very important, where he is talking about the basic purpose of art. Or if you read the preface to Dorian Gray, where he says that that Oscar Wilde says that all art by definition is immoral. You know, how can you say that artistic purpose is to give a moral idea, right? And that is why, so that is the provocative theme. Or if you read Charles Baudelaire, for example, there is a poet called Charles Baudelaire. Charles Baudelaire, and his famous book is Le Flou du Mal, means the flowers of evil. The flowers of evil. This title itself very significant. That the flowers of evil. What does it signify? The flowers of evil. Right? Just while attempting the answer, this flowers of evil. What is this flowers of evil? Can there is a possibility of a flowers to have an evil aspect? How can a flowers be bad? Right? Flowers is, and this is this title itself is a reactionary mood. It is a reaction against Victorian dogma or Victorian orthodox or Victorian morality, and this is how artistic conventions, the new artistic conventions, that the flower of evil. That means that the flower is, but it is evil, means it is not good. The flower is not good. The flower means it is pious, normally it is pristine, it is auspicious. These are certain characteristics of flower: pious, pristine, auspicious. flowers cannot be evil. There is no possibility because we offer flowers to God. But when you read this poem by Luflu Dumal, you find that there is a flowers which is evil, right? There is a William Morris, Poems and Ballad. There is a William Morris. And he had a book called Poems and Ballads, right? There is a Gustav Flaubert, Gustav Flaubert, Gustav Flaubert, who had written a book called Madame Bovary, Madame Bovary, right? Madame Bovary. And this Madame Bovary is a moral character. She is a moral character. Means that she is not immoral, not moral. So she is a moral character. And that's how later you find in D.H. Lawrence, who says, D.H. Lawrence says that the biggest immortality is when any author possesses morality. When any author possesses morality. So just mention these writers, right? When you are writing any essay on decadence period or aesthetic period or art for art's sake, इसका क्वेश्चन बहुत पूछा जाता है यूजीसी नेट में, टीजीटी पीजीटी में कि व्हाट इज आर्ट फॉर आर्ट सेक, हाउ एस्थेटिक मूवमेंट इज वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट. इन सारे चीजों को आप दिखाइएगा. तो मेरा यह कहना था, व्हाट आई वांटेड टू टेल यू इज दैट हाउ दिस लिटरेचर दे आर टोटली अगेंस्ट द विक्टोरियन एथॉस, विक्टोरियन मोरालिटी, विक्टोरियन स्टैंडर्ड. For example, when you read Charles Dickens, or you read George Eliot, or you read, I told you that Thomas Hardy is not poems. His poems are they are the beautiful portrayal of the Victorian norms and society. But when you read his fiction, and that's how you know that he wrote poem later. Earlier he was a novelist, so he thought that no, he was a poet, but later he became novelist. And he thought that to be a novelist was a lucrative way of living life. That if you write a novel, you will have more money. That's because in Victorian society was highly means that there was a great demand of literature in serial form, and that's how this was a culture, this was an industry. Writing was a form of industry, and that's how. Even Thomas Hardy, he also became fiction writer later. So this is what we call these writers, that they wrote in a way which is completely against Victorian dogma, and that's how Findesical means end of century. So that is aesthetic and decadence, where writers prioritize art for art's sake. Art for art, not moral. So the basic purpose of art is to give its own sake. It must have a completely objectivity, right? Art is complete in itself, right? And that is how when you read picture of Dorian Gray, you find hedonism. The picture of Dorian Gray that has a theme of hedonism. You know, this hedonism. This is the main theme of a picture of Dorian Gray, right? Hedonism means that beauty for beauty, right? That always wants to remain beautiful. Right, wants to remain, always wants to remain beautiful. This is hedonism. So Oscar Wilde created a theme called hedonism, right? The theme of cynicism, world weariness, and unconventional lifestyle. There is a theme of cynicism, cynicism, worldliness, worldliness, you know, worldliness, pleasure, pleasure, you know. So that became very important thing, hedonism. And also, as I mentioned earlier, Thomas Hardy, in his novel like Tales of the D'Urberville and Jude the Obscure, he was talking about sexual theme, sexual seduction, sexual issue, and that's how sexual dissident. There is a term called sexual dissident, sexual dissident. It was this sexual dissident that was revolt against Victorian sexual code, Victorian sexual code, right? Sexual dissident, which was against the Victorian sexual code. So that is how I want to tell you that if you read these writers, you find that how these writers, they wrote in a quite different mood, and that's why they are for adventure, they are for aesthetic, there is scientific writing, right? The same period. So this period is very important, 1990s. And art for, in fact, there is a book written by Henry James. This is an essay. Henry James, who has written a book called The Art of Fiction. The Art of Fiction. This was written in 1884, where he says that Victorian writing is a large and baggy monster. Raw and baggy monster. There is no artistic perception. There is no artistic perception. There is no artistic perception. They are whole, but there is no art. There is no craft. Literature is not craft. Literature is not, because Victorian fiction you find 100 pages, more than 4,400, 500 pages. But there is no artistic unity according to Henry James, because plot and character is quite different. Right? That is how art of fiction, he says. But then George Bernard Shaw also, he read Mrs. Barron's Professor, and George Bernard Shaw says that in fact I do not want to attack by character, but the reader as well. Right? That's why I say that his satire is not against the reader, for example, but the reader as well. Right? What I want to tell you that George Bernard Shaw कहता है अपने प्ले में कि मैं जो लिख रहा हूं, that is not directly this is not attacked the characters that is portrayed in the novels, rather the audience as well. George Bernard Shaw has mind the audience. तो audience को भी ध्यान में रख करके George Bernard Shaw लिख रहे हैं, and that's how if you read in this period 1990s aesthetic period, you find George Bernard Shaw's Mrs. Barron's Professor. Other writers is Ernest Dowson, John Davidson, you know, Ernest Dowson, John Davidson, right? Then you have A.E. Houseman, A.E. Houseman, right? He is also, they explore themes of melancholy and the fleeting nature of life. Melancholy and the fleeting nature of life. So this is called decadence period, or the period of art for art's sake. And in the same time, you find the emergence of later science fiction like H.G. Wells, the Time Machine, who is often called the father of science fiction. Then you have and sexual openness, as I told you earlier, and again I am saying that the sex which was a taboo, sexual openness, that was a taboo. This became the crucial point, sexual openness. and that's how you find DHLR and says Dixon. So that is how Victorian idea of morality was completely destroyed. Then you have Walter Horatio Pater, as I told you that, and he has written Studies in the History of Renaissance. This is very important book. Studies in the History of Renaissance. This title is very important. You must read this book. Studies in the History of Studies in the History of Renaissance. Studies in the History of Renaissance, right? This is written in 1873, and then revised the Renaissance studies in art and poetry, where he advocated an idea of the intense inner life. Intense inner life. This is the idea. Intense inner life. And this is the motto of aesthetic period. Right? What we call intense inner life. That is the study of intense inner life. And this is what he says, that intense inner life probably taken as the manifesto of aesthetic. Right? And then you have Thomas Carlyle, Sartre's Resorters. Sartre Resorters. Sartre Resorters. Right? This is published in 1833. So that is also to some extent has artistic perception. So what I want to tell you is that जब आर्ट की बात होती है, देखिए इंग्लिश लिटरेचर में दो चीज पाते हैं, आर्ट एंड मोरालिटी. You see, Harold Pinter has written his Nobel lecture. He was awarded Nobel lecture in 2005. And Harold Pinter's the topic of his Nobel lecture is art, truth, and politics. This is very important. So what I want to tell you that art and truth, this is very important. So इसके पहले आप देखेंगे आर्ट वर्सेस मोरालिटी. क्या आर्ट का मोरल पर्पस होना चाहिए? आखिरकार आर्ट क्यों लिखा जाता है, राइटर क्यों लिखता है? तो ये बात बहुत पहले से आता है कि व्हाट इज ब्यूटी एंड व्हाट इज ट्रूथ. आर्ट इज फॉर आर्ट सेक, आर्ट इज फॉर लाइफ सेक, आर्ट इज फॉर मोरालिटी सेक, एंड दैट्स हाउ. यदि आप जॉन कीट्स को पढ़ेंगे तो कहते हैं ब्यूटी इज ट्रूथ एंड ट्रूथ इज ब्यूटी, दैट ऑल वी मस्ट नो ऑन दिस अर्थ. दिस इज फ्रॉम ओड ऑन ग्रेसियनर. और जॉन कीट्स और भी कहते हैं a thing of beauty joy forever, right? And that you also find in later William Blake, who was also an artist and painter, right? So मेरा कहना यह था कि ये हमेशा से बात आ रही है, लेकिन विक्टोरियन पीरियड में क्या था कि लिटरेचर का जो मकसद ही था, that was basically for the moral and social purpose. एक बात बन गई थी विक्टोरियन पीरियड में, देयर वाज एन एजेंडा दैट द बेसिक पर्पस ऑफ अ राइटर टू एक्सप्लोर सम मोरल आइडिया. उसी के खिलाफ जो मोमेंट आया, दैट इज कॉल्ड प्री रेफेलाइट, जो कि बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट टर्म है, उसको आप पढ़ लीजिएगा. प्री रेफेलाइट, डिकेडेंस, एस्थेटिक, है ना. जो भी आपके पीरियड आते हैं, फिंडेसिकल, इसको हम बोलते हैं टर्न ऑफ द सेंचुरी, जितने भी सब चीजें लिखी गई हैं, दैट इज द अगेंस्ट दिस विक्टोरियन मोरालिटी. और इसी को ध्यान में रखते हुए आप लिखेंगे आर्ट फॉर आर्ट से कोई ऐसे आता है, एस्थेटिक में कोई ऐसे आता है, प्री रेफेलाइट में कोई ऐसे आता है. तो आप इन्हीं चीजों को लिखना है. और कुछ राइटर को आप मेंशन कर सकते हैं, जैसे एसी स्विनबर्न हो गए, या एक एक सबसे इंपॉर्टेंट है डांटे गैब्रियल रोजदी, डांटे गैब्रियल रोजदी, इनकी किताब है, उस किताब का नाम है द ब्लेसेड डेमोजिल ए। दिस इज अ कंप्लीटली मेडिवलिज्म, जो मेडिवलिज्म आर्ट है, जो डब्ल्यू से डेमोजिल, ठीक है, मेडिवलिज्म आर्ट की बात होती है। और उसी समय जो है पोएम्स एंड बैलेट, ए विलियम मॉरिस, मॉरिस की किताब है पोएम्स एंड बैलेट। और जॉन रस्किन, जॉन रस्किन ने एक किताब लिखा मॉडर्न पेंटर्स, जिसमें से उन्होंने एक टर्म क्वाइन किया, और जो बहुत ही फेमस टर्म है, दिस इज कॉल्ड द पैथेटिक फैलेसी, दिस इज कॉल्ड द पैथेटिक फैलेसी। This theory is also highly about art, right? And Gustave Flaubert's, Madame Bovary, William Morris, hedonism, Baudelaire, and DJ Rosdi, Blessed Demoiselle, and then picture of Dorian Gray, picture of Dorian Gray, Blessed Demoiselle. तो इन सबको मिला करके, if you write this, keep in mind the name of these writers, keep the mind the name of some of the major characteristics, and characteristics are, as I told you, that the intense feeling, art for art's sake, no moral character, completely objectivity, an intense inner feeling, art is for art purpose, नॉट फॉर लाइफ पर्पज। इन सारी चीजों को दिखाने के बाद जितने राइटर को मैंने मेंशन किया, इनको आप मेंशन कर देंगे, योर आंसर विल बी प्रिपेयर्ड। इफ देयर इज एनी क्वेश्चन regarding write an essay on art for art's sake, write an essay what is Raphaelite, write an essay on what is decadence, write an essay what is turn of century, तो आपका आंसर अच्छे से हो जाएगा। मैं अपने इस लेक्चर को यहीं स्टॉप करता हूं, and in my next lecture I will be taking what we call 20th century, the beginning of 20th century, and that will be Edwardian period when Edward II became king। और यह जो मेरा अगला लेक्चर होगा, that will be in the continuous form of the history of English literature। Thank you।